and Emergency Medicine for
Yeah,
another book.
Start now.
Okay. So hi everyone, we're here at Academic Life and Emergency Medicine for another book club discussion. Today we're discussing a history of the present illness. And we're very fortunate to have with us the author, Louise Aronson, to be part of our discussion. So we want to focus today on talking about narratives in medicine. This book consists of 16 stories that surround medical culture and offer many unique perspectives in medicine. So we want to talk about that, what narratives mean in medicine, how we can use them in our medical education, and what it's like to be a physician writer. So I'd like to open up the discussion.
I think that we were already having a pretty strong discussion that we had just cut off, and actually we can probably just continue that with Louise talking about, in the light of what had happened, just how much happens in the training of a resident that is, outside of just the medical walls, but what happens to a person emotionally, what happens to what the experience that they have, and if they don't have an outlet to share that, what does that mean to them as a person?
Right. Well, we were talking about it in terms of reflective writing, and Jordana was saying that she's maybe the only one that reads their residents' reflections, and you learn so much about them and about your training program, I think, that you wouldn't know otherwise. And is it different than skills and knowledge? Yes, probably, but I think it's essential to building the skills and knowledge, understanding how people are feeling. And we were also talking about the LEAP tool we developed at UCSF, and one of the things it asks explicitly is not just for your thoughts on something, but for your emotions, because so often in medicine we discount that, or we actually actively keep it out of our notes and our comments and our presentations as if it doesn't affect everyone. And we know from the rates of burnout and suicide and everything else that it affects all too many of us.
Right. I think so much of medicine, I mean, in everyday life, and I can only talk about the ER, but we're psychologically traumatized on a daily basis. We tell loved ones that their family members have died, they have terminal cancer. And so this is narrative is one unique way of being able to channel those thoughts, emotions, experiences in a way that lets you kind of make sense of that experience. And the issue is whether is narrative the best way to do this, or talking about it, or going for a run, or doing yoga? Is that another way? But I feel like narrative has a unique advantage because it makes you focus your emotions and experiences in a way that allows you to do in a little bit more of a it makes you want to I don't know what I'm trying to say. We're just talking about this, but makes you want to focus your experiences in a way that allows you to make sense of your experiences.
Right. Well, I think writers from Michel de Montaigne, who invented the essay form, to more recently Abraham Verghese, have talked about that it's through writing that you learn what you think, and the word essay is from the French essayer, which is to try. And it's to try to understand something, and that's the point of reflection and of narrative. And I think, I'm all for going running to relieve the stress of our jobs. The endorphins are super helpful, and I do think that serves a purpose too. But it doesn't necessarily, actually sometimes when the endorphins really kick in, it does lead to clarity. But I think active reflection and the process of writing bring you to points where you're stymied that you didn't realize you were, and also getting other people's perspectives on that. It needs to be, we tend to think of reflection as a very private process, and I think one of the things we've learned is that in sharing it, you learn that you're not alone in your challenges, and you get other perspectives that really help. I mean, I see this all the time when I think the more upset and the more disinclined I am to discuss something that happened clinically, the more helpful it is when I actually do write about it and discuss it with others, because I get perspectives I couldn't get on my own.
And I think it's something that a lot of your characters in the stories go through. There are some who are suffering alone. There are some who are lucky enough to find another character within their story world that they can connect with. And there are some who later on, because your characters tend to, if not repeat, but their world may repeat again, and so you can look back and see how they may have developed over the years. And there are a few characters who are really tragic in that they are never able to really share what they're going through, or what they end up doing. I think, like the doctor, the surgeon who's married to the psychologist, I wonder if the way she ultimately dealt with her frustrations, is that even in a healthy way? The story ends with her kind of dressed, getting up and walking out. You don't know, is she walking out on her marriage? Is she walking out on her life? And so the act of being able to share, I think you make such a strong point, is so important in all the stories that you have.
Yeah, and another theme that sort of ran through the book was this connection between the arts and science, and many of the characters in medicine sort of struggled with communicating and expressing themselves through art. They mentioned choosing a book for medicine based on loving the painting on the cover that was an artist that they liked. And I just think a lot of us do have that connection, that art is an important part of being a physician, and that we deal with emotions, human experience, and yet I think from my training and my experience of watching others going along the medical path is that we give up some of that, and that most of us went into medicine. We didn't choose to go into other fields in science because we like that human aspect, and somehow we learn to kind of separate the two and stay distant from it and control our emotions, but not always in the healthiest way. And so I discovered narrative medicine because I always thought that I was going to write about my experience during training, and then I found that I wasn't really doing that, and I wasn't doing it the right way or the way I wanted, and I thought it was actually really important, and sad that I had lost that. So I have my residents now do it because I followed this LEAP guideline that I found that Louise Aronson had published, and I found it very helpful for my residents that to get them writing and talking about their experience and also reflecting on it and better understanding what they're going through and experiencing during their training.
The last story in the book, some people have asked, is that an essay? And it's supposed to reflect back on all the stories that come before. It is fiction. The character's life is fiction. But some of the perspectives on writing and medicine are clearly my perspectives. I would say if there is anything that's autobiographical in that, it's in the book. It's some of those essayistic moments in that final story. And there is one autobiographical moment, which is when she says, you know, she's sort of finished her training and she feels so full up with stories that they're just pouring out, you know, or seeping out, or you don't know what to do with it. And I think when you touch on so many lives at such critical junctures, it did feel to me anyway, and still to some extent, although now I cope with it better, that you have to process that in some way. I think so often, you know, medicine is both science and art, and the science gives you knowledge and discovery and things you can do, but I think the art part brings it meaning and allows you to then, once you've imbued it with meaning, you can process it and sort of move on to the next thing in a more healthy way. Mm-hmm. You know, but you mentioned earlier that not everybody likes to write, and I think we have to think about how, you know, I do believe writing serves a function cognitively that not all other forms of expression do, but I think we also need to think about how do we help people reflect in other ways, either through speaking if writing is too traumatic. Are there ways of using audio and video? There's a guy in England that advocates for that. I think I don't understand those mediums well enough to weigh in on that.
Yeah, we actually, sorry. Yeah, go ahead, Nikita, sorry.
My question for both Louise and Alberto, because you both write, is my kind of theory has always been, unproven by anything, but my theory has always been that the art of medical training in and of itself destroys our ability to communicate in a meaningful way, especially in the written form. this shorthand language we learn, acronyms for everybody, labeling everything, the desire to always want to characterize the disease exactly to the fullest. I wonder if that stamps on someone's creativity and also takes away from their ability to write sentences that are actual grammatically correct sentences and express ideas that are paragraph form as opposed to phrases. What are your thoughts on that?
I think that those are the detractors you brought up. The fact that we have so much a great subject matter from our daily experiences that we're unique in that in having all these unique experiences that give us food for our writing. And in a way, I don't know, I wanted to ask Dr. Aronson this question, but I think that it was one unique experience in my life, seeing a victim of domestic violence, that brought me into writing my first medical thriller. And so I wonder, was it one particular story or patient interaction that made you want to write this book?
No, I think it was the accumulation of them. But it was a little bit what Nikita was saying, where you feel like even the language of medicine hems you in. I think when we were in medical school, they said learning medicine is like learning another language, an entire foreign language. And then we write our notes in this objective way, as if, if the four of us saw the same patient, we would actually each write a different note, and yet we pretend that it's this objective thing. And, I guess ideally there would be certain similarities, but it was that sort of constraint of the personality and of expressing, and I feel like that constrains us as providers, but also how we can imagine patients. If you reduce people to a list that is sort of diabetes, hypertension, cancer, instead of a list that is what matters to them and what their family loves best about them or will remember them, you're really sort of squelching their humanity. And I think when I finished training, I felt like I had all these stories that I wanted to get out. And one of the first things, I finished fellowship, I took a vacation, and I signed up for courses that were creative, because I really did feel that medicine had squelched parts of me that really mattered and that would make me a better doctor and a happier doctor and a doctor able to stay a doctor over the long haul. So I don't know if there was a single experience, but it was certainly a bunch of them. And my stories, some of these stories, because I wasn't a very good writer when I started, it took the better part of a decade, plus I had to do my job, which takes a few hours a week. But they evolved from different people, and sometimes it was different things in different people. It was a moment I saw a colleague do something, or I heard about something, or a patient I really that was meaningful to me. Although strangely, if you write something over many years, like there's one story, Super Sex, actually, which really grew out of this one guy for whom I had such affection. And now I feel like I can't even remember the real man because he turned into this character. But what I hope is that the story still stands as a testament to my deep affection for this guy and who he was, even though he never told stories like the guy tells. And it's different, and yet hopefully it captures him. And that's one of the fun of the stories is that it changes, and yet you're sort of doing it as a testament to what's especially meaningful in medicine and about our fellow human beings.
Just hearing you say these things and reading your book, you just can tell that you would have enjoy your practice more by really listening to your patient stories, because that really is essence of medicine, is that we hear stories, and we reflect on emergency medicine since that's what the three of us do, but we start with a history, and most fields do, and for us that really determines the diagnosis of the patient, the workup we're doing. But we hear so many stories throughout the day, and I think if you don't learn to really enjoy those stories and make them meaningful, it's very difficult to have a pleasurable career. And if you can appreciate those stories and the humanity behind our work, it can just be really the most rewarding careers I can imagine. So I think it is an important art is to be able to learn how to listen properly, understand our patients, understand ourselves. And these are important skills in just being a physician.
You know, can I just jump in for 1 second? Because while you're talking, just because you guys do emergency medicine, and I tend to do sort of, well, right now I do house calls. So it's long-term primary care, long-term hospice care. It's just, you know, we have much longer-term relationships with people. And so I was thinking, it almost within medicine, we have these different genres. Like you guys are flash fiction, and I'm, depending on how long I know the patient, maybe it's a short story, maybe it's a novella, maybe it's a novel if it's someone I care for 8 or 10 years. And I wonder if, I don't know if that would be of interest to anyone else, but if you think about what you enjoy, what sort of stories you enjoy, might that help you sort out which specialty you'd thrive?
Right.
I don't know.
True, actually. That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Instead of those charts that say, do you like crazy people or do you like
Yeah, do you like dark or working in a light room or a dark room?
I had a question.
Blogs or epic poems?
My question was, Louise, it's great to know that it took so long for you to become such a great writer. That gives hope for all of us who are such terrible writers right now. The biggest question that I always have, especially when I read news articles about patients' experiences, how do you deal with the HIPAA issue? And is it as simple as changing the name of the person or their ethnicity, or do you get permission from everybody you write about?
That's
so
a
what
really...
happens with HIPAA? What about like your colleagues' HIPAA? They're not patients, but I'm sure no one wants to be written about it in negative light.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's a great and an important question, because you do have, you can either get permission and then you can relay things to the best of your ability, how you remember it, or you need to change things. But actually how you change things and what you change depends on where you're going to publish what you publish. So some medical journals, like JAMA in particular, gives very specific guidance on what you can change and what you can't change, because they feel like it becomes fiction if you make certain sorts of changes, and yet at the same time you need to protect the patient. So thinking about where you're going to put it and whether they have guidance for you matters too. I had the advantage of, for the book, for History of the Present Illness, it was fiction. So really, it may have started with a person, but particularly because it did take as long as it did, it really changed. And I also felt like for each character I brought in, more years of experience with a variety of different people and patients. And then in writing fiction, one of the reasons my fiction was so bad initially was that I would have this notion of what really happened, or a notion of what should happen in my story, and I would try and push these characters towards that. Mm-hmm. And if you've actually created a real character, they're going to do what that human being would do in those situations, not what I thought they should do based on my preconceptions about the story. And the stories got much better when I just thought about, I've created this whole person. What is he or she going to do in this circumstance? And then that just takes it away from my initial intent. These days I'm writing much more nonfiction, and so I have to think about, how do I change this to protect the person without actually lying or moving towards fiction? Sometimes changing gender helps a lot. Sometimes in medicine we're really wedded to a particular disease. But if the point is somebody's critically ill, does it really matter if it's liver failure or kidney failure? Does it matter if it's this kind of cancer or that? And sometimes things like that, which aren't so big, are big enough that people don't recognize themselves. On the other hand, the opposite is sort of true too. I did a workshop, I do a bunch of writing workshops with physicians, and in one a couple years ago, a doctor from Rochester, New York, talked about writing a piece for the New York Times and then receiving letters, I think from maybe Texas and Hawaii, from patients saying, "Doctor, how did you know my story?" And of course, he was writing about a patient in Rochester and he'd made some changes. But one of the things that distinguishes literature is that through the particular you reach the universal, and these people saw themselves because he did a good job.
Yeah.
One thing that came up when we were reading also How We Die was who the audience was for this book. So there's this combination of medicine and also fiction. In his case, I think it was more nonfiction, but how much medicine do you incorporate into your story, and would probably depend on your audience. So was there an audience that you had in mind while writing these stories?
Well, initially I didn't think it would have an audience. Like, I really thought this was my extracurricular activity, so there were no limits, because it just really never occurred to me that anything would come of this. It was really just fun and therapeutic for me. And then at some point I really did want people who weren't in medicine to be able to read it. I wanted to, I went back to school and did a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, and I wanted to write a book that was literary in a way that people who weren't in medicine could appreciate. So then that left me with a sort of quandary about the medical terms, and I decided to use them the way Junot Diaz uses Spanish, basically. Yes, it's not totally jargon-filled like one of our notes, but Junot Diaz puts in Spanish, and if you understand Spanish, you have one experience. But if you don't, he's still a brilliant writer, right? And you can totally appreciate his work. And it adds to the feeling and the voice and the sound of the sentences and the experience of the reading. And so I decided I would use medicine in that way. Not jargon, but definitely present on the page, because that was the culture I was writing about.
Right.
Have you heard from your non-medical readers about whether or not it was too much medicine or it was just enough?
Well, I guess maybe people who don't have nice things to say don't say anything. I mean, I don't know. I haven't heard too many negative things. I mean, maybe they start reading it and they stop reading it because they don't like it. But mostly the feedback has been, shockingly nice, and people find it gives them insights into the world of medicine, patients and doctors alike, in a way that they haven't experienced previously, which was what I hoped to do. So that's lovely feedback. But there are people out there that were like, "What is this?" and stopped reading it, because we all do that with certain books. But
right, yeah.
I guess I just haven't heard from them.
So another question we wanted to talk about towards the end of our discussion today was recently an article came out in the New York Times that was written by a resident, a first-year resident, reflecting on recent suicides from medical interns. And in that article, he advocates that he thinks to make us better physicians, we need to be able to voice our experience and talk about our vulnerabilities during our training, and finds that this is a flaw in our medical culture. And that theme also comes up in your books as well. And so he, being a reflection, this article, and also his discussion in the letter saying how he thinks that we should have more of this in our culture. What are ways that, as a group, we think we can advocate for that to happen in medical culture, and do we think that there is really a need for that?
Well, it does seem like reflection is more and more being incorporated, and I think that's helpful. One of the issues, and when I'm teaching it at UCSF, I always mention this explicitly, which probably is not as good as figuring out how to fully address it. But what I say to our students and even residents and fellows is that up until the point of when we're asking them to write reflections, most of the time when we ask them to write essays, it's to show off, right? It's to get accepted to medical school or to the residency of your choice. You want to show yourself in the best light. And now we're kind of flipping that on its head. We're still evaluating them, although we're not obviously scoring the reflections, but usually the people reading them are their attendings. So they're being evaluated in some way, and yet they're being told to be vulnerable because that's the only way they can grow and process those things. And that's a tough message. How do we make them trust us? One of the ways we've tried to do it at UCSF is in the sort of doctoring course small groups, because there is a degree of trust that develops in those settings. But I think we also need to do more and more faculty development about how do you simultaneously be in a position of evaluating someone and create a space that's safe for them to be vulnerable and then get help with that vulnerability. And again, with our program, one of the ways we've done that is that you're evaluated on your engagement with the reflection process. Are you working at it? Not on the content of your reflection and things like that. But it brings us back also to what you said at the beginning, that we really, these reflections provide really valuable data, and it's of a data that's different from anything else we have. And I think we haven't yet figured out how you use that to full advantage for the mental health and wellness of residents, as well as for the good of the training process.
What I like about what you just said is that the students who go through your courses are not graded on the content, but on their engagement. Because what I worry when you say words like narrative, vulnerable, mental health, those are very strong words with not positive connotations in the medical field. Nobody, you're proud when you can see a resuscitation and not cry in it, or the medical student that passes out during their first surgery is certainly not looked upon positively. So I think in order to advance narrative medicine and to actually get people to buy in, you're going to have to also emphasize that narrative medicine is not just about the tragic experiences, but also about the really positive experiences that you have also. The first time you do see a delivery of a baby, the first time that you are able to successfully do something really hard, that also is equally a part of medicine. And a lot of what I experienced in my emergency medicine training felt like such highs and lows. I could have such an emotional high after a shift because something really awesome happened. The next shift could be the complete opposite, and it would bring me to such an emotional low. And I never felt like an emotionally unstable person. But anybody who goes through such extremes is just going to be so confused at the end of it. So being able to emphasize that it's about the good and the bad, I think is important.
Yeah, that's something I try to emphasize when I'm teaching the ideas or questions that we put out there to writing a reflection. You might want to comment on a great moment you had, or when you discovered that you love ultrasound or something like that. But I think in what you just said brings up that this idea of having transparency when we work, and for us as now attendings, to talk about those hard experiences we've had, those great experiences, and sort of like we've all been there. Like what the resident mentions in his op-ed is that this moment of clarity for him was when his senior, who he really looked up to, or I think it was just a resident that he really looked up to, mentioned how he struggles and feels inadequate too, and he just couldn't believe that, and that was kind of a relief for him. So I think no matter where you are in your training, there's always sort of someone below you in the totem pole, and if we can just be more vocal and try to connect more with each other, sort of have empathy for each other in the field, and with not just with our patients but also with each other, is important, I think, to change that.
It's about connection too, because we were talking about it before when you wrote in Super Sex about the world suddenly and somewhat arbitrarily consider me fit for unsupervised practice. We've all had that experience at one point of our career, right after residency, when you're an attending and you turn around and you're like, wow, there's no one else to bounce this off. And narrative, I think it's not just about writing, but also about reading, because reading your book, you can tell that we've had similar experiences, and I think we all can. And it's just about that connection, knowing, kind of like what that gentleman said when he had a meal with his senior resident, that we've all had experiences. We've all experienced the highs and the lows, and it's really important to have that connection among each other.
Yeah. So we're going to be closing up. There's just, if there's any more comments that anyone would like to make in the group.
I just want to ask Louise one more question about, I attended a great MEDEX talk by her last week, a conference by Larry Chu at Stanford, and there was a great talk you had about the 3 different levels of communication, and I think that talk is a natural extension of this book club because of the audience that you write for and what it means, but also now to specifically write to engage patients themselves. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts were on what the role of communication plays, especially in this world of social media and blogging and Twitter.
Right. Well, I've thought about this notion that at the beginning of time in medicine, patient-doctor communication was just that. It was you with your one patient. And then scholarship came about in the last maybe century and a half. But that was still talking within our small circles. And it seems to me that in the 21st century, particularly with social media, but really with the internet, communication is transformed. And so I think there is this one-on-many type communication that exists now, and this interactive communication. And we tend to think of these as separate activities, but I think they're distinguished by, you know, it's less medical jargon. It's less just us talking to each other. It's much more speaking to the public or speaking across specialties as we are now. And social media has been really good for that. It also makes it bi-directional. That was one of the great things about MedX. It's the only conference I've ever been to where they also had patients. And isn't it ridiculous that we spend all this time thinking, how best do we take care of these people, and we never include them in that discussion? That's insane, and that's kind of the brilliance of MedX. But I think it's the way in which this new communication ecosystem, which the internet scholar Clay Shirky has called it, has really transformed medicine, and it's a great opportunity for us. So I now think that there's this third form of communication in medicine called public medical communication, right. And it does use social media, and it includes blogging or essays for medical journals, and very much this reflective, interactive, accessible communication that really wasn't possible before, but I think enriches all our lives and will enrich medicine and discussions about health and health care.
Yeah.
One thing, I was just looking at my Twitter poll. Michelle Lynn, who's the editor of the blog, who is a colleague of yours.
Yes, she's fantastic.
Regrets to say she couldn't come. She's at a conference, but was glad that you were able to join us.
Excellent. Yeah, she's sort of, I think she's our social media leading edge. The ER docs seem to be really good at all of this. And so at UCSF, Michelle's definitely it.
Right, but it is, you know, even what we know about narrative medicine, it's usually divided into those 4 categories of communication: the physician and patient, physician and self, physician and colleagues, and then this physician and society. Mm-hmm. And I think being able to communicate on all those levels will help us be better physicians and offer better patient care. So I'd like to close this saying that we will have the post up, and there will be a link also to Louise Aronson's website, and there's also a reader's guide there, which was very nice to use while reading this book too. And we really enjoyed having you be with us today as part of this discussion, and we appreciate your contribution.
Thank you. It was totally fun. My first Google Hangout. It was great.